Okay, good morning, everyone. Morning. So, our task today is to try and continue a scan of the major achievements of the Geonim. Major, I can't say what major achievements of the Geonim, but at least talk about some of the achievements of the Geonim. And we're looking at 600 years of 500 years of Jewish history. So, as I said at the beginning, it's a little overwhelming to talk about this as a single topic, but nonetheless, that's what we're trying to do. And then also look at some of perhaps the life stories of a few of the Geonim before we come to what will perhaps be the most significant focus of our discussion, which is that of Rav Saadia Gaon, the first Jewish philosopher. So I mentioned last week some of their achievements. We began speaking about their role in fixing the calendar, very important role. Um, and we discussed the controversies that they engaged in starting the fight against the Karaite heresy, which was only really concluded with in the era of the Rishonim. Even the great Rambam himself was still involved in some of that controversy, some of that discussion. Noises from the building work over here. We'll have to cope with that. What else can we say about the Geonim? We discussed them fixing the annual Torah reading. We discussed various minhagim that they introduced, for example, Simchas Torah, dancing or celebrations, the hakafas, some of the aspects of the hakafas of the Hoshanas. We spoke about the Megillas that were fixed by the Geonim. The Megillah of Esther was obviously always a feature. That's from the Takana of Chazal. That's from the Takana of the Nevi'im. Already in the lifetime of Esther, that was fixed. However, the other Megillas, the Megillah of my recording over here, by the way, yeah, the other Megillas, the Megillas of Rus associated with Shavuos and Eicha and Keheles and She'ashirim and so on. Again, these are practices of the Geonim. I think we spoke about Slichus being structured by the Geonim. The concept of doing Teshuvah pre-Yom Amaraim is obviously an appropriate thing to do, but the structure of Slichus mimicking almost an additional daily tefillah, starting with an Ashrei and a Kaddish, and finishing with a Kaddish and possibly Aleinu if it's said by itself, is from the Geonim, with the central body of the Hashem Kel Lachem Chanun as its sort of Amida text, its central text. Though the Piyutim, the poets that surround all of this, are obviously some date from the Geonim, and many of them date from post-Geonic, the era of the Rishonim. Other minhagim that we think came from the Gaonic era are tashlich, again, not mentioned explicitly in the Gemara. I spoke one year about how there's maybe even hints of tashlich from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Plug for the upcoming Ezra and Nehemiah Shirim, but at least formalized as a minhag. The first time we see this is in the Geonim. They also standardized texts, for example, the text of Kaddish, and many of the documentations that we use, for example, the text of the Ksuva. So again, the concept of a Ksuva is a Torah law. The fact that the Ksuva has to be drafted as a document is something that is already mentioned in the Gemara, and a whole Masechta of Gemara that talks about this. But exactly how do you draft it and how do you run it, and a standardization, more or less, of the text of the Ksuva is a product of the Gaonic era. So basically, they took all the halachos and this is much of what they did. They took the complex halachos of the Gemara and they gave a workable pro forma that can be used by Klal Yisrael. So another example of this is
obviously before the Geonim, there was no standard thing of get.
Before the Geonim, a ksuva and a get would be drafted by a Talmud Chacham who would go through the Gemara and work out what needs to be included in the document, and then would create it. Now, presumably, there were people that were copying from other people, and they were floating around various sorts of crib sheets and the like. But basically, there wasn't a standardized text for these. You learn through the Gemara, and the Gemara says what has to be included in these really important documents, and then you draft it. Nowadays, more or less, you have a standardized text of a ksuva, and then you fill in the details depending on is this a first marriage or second marriage, what the status of the couple are, what sums they want to give. The Sephardi text has more flexibility somewhat than Ashkenazi text in terms of the sums, but basically you're filling in somewhat of a pro forma. A get needs to be tweaked to individual circumstances. The big issue of the get is location and names and dates and Again, different tweaks depending on various other details, but again, we're using a pretty much a pro forma in creating it, and these are products of Gaonic era standardizations. Yes.
Emerged from the ball, as it were.
Yes. Okay, written evidence of this, little bits, and I'll talk about some of them, but not huge amounts, but little bit. We will, as we get near the end of the Gaonic era, meet the figure of. So I'm just blanking in a minute for a moment. Okay, I'll come back to me, and we'll come back later to some of the sources. Okay, so these are some of the achievements of the Geonim, and as I said, by and large, this is a lot of what they're doing. They're taking out of the Gemara and standardizing things. Another product of the Gaonic era is anonymous, is the Haggadah Shal Pesach, and again, the logic of that is. How do you run your Seder night? Well, pre their standardization, you have to know all the halachos of Seder night, which is a vast array of mitzvahs, and structure them in order. So got to eat certain lots of matzah, certain lots of maror, and you have to have lean at certain times, and you have to get through abakosis, and this whole halachas about how sipur should be. Think of all the shiurim pre-Pesach. It has to be derech she'ela to shuvah. It has to question and answer. It has to be maskul b'genusim asayim b'shvach. It has to begin with negatives and conclude with positives. There's which sort of negative and positive does it mean from from our pagan origins, or does it just mean from the physical negatives that avodim hayinu? So it's a very complicated sequence of halachas. And again, the Geonim standardized all of this and created Haggadah so that you can navigate your way through the Seder. And these are the achievements of the Geonim. One other thing I'll mention maybe is the practices of Yahrzeit. Again, is standardized by the era of the Geonim. And we have a timeline, which I'm not going to go into now, as to when, more or less, when each of these standardizations took place. But that's really the job of the Geonim. They are the great standardizers. By the way, one of the blessings of Jewish history is that they managed to complete this work before the decline of the Gaonate, before the decline of the Geonim, because roughly from the year 1000, multiple Torah centers are set up in different locations in the world, and the Geonim decline. We've discussed this. This is the transition to the era of the Rishonim, and now you have a Torah center in Spain, a Torah center in France, in Germany, a Torah center in Italy, a Torah center in North Africa, and still a continued Torah center in the Middle East, but they each go their own way, and they began following local psokim, local rulings. And from that derives the origins of Nusach Sfard, Nusach Ashkenaz, the sort of different minhagim that we have, because now people are turning to their localized rabbinate rather than a centralized rabbinate. So there were obviously some degree of pre-existing minhagim in each of these locations, even in the era of the Geonim. The Geonim didn't achieve complete uniformity, but the large structures of Jewish life, the Geonim set in place and are adopted more or less by the whole rabbinic world. And only after that does the Jewish world split into a more fragmented model. And it's because of that more or less the different communities all look very, very similar. So even though we like focusing on difference, the truth is once you get your head around the sort of slight change in accent or change in tunes, the similarity between the Kaddish of the Ashkenazim and the Kaddish of the Sephardim and the Kaddish of the Yemenites or the Nusach Tefillah of all of those is remarkable. So as much as we can spend a lot of interesting time talking about the differences between the different communities, basically we're all pretty much the same. Again, you can look at a Sephardic Ksuvah and an Ashkenazi Ksuvah, and you can focus on the differences because there's slightly more flowery language used, it's slightly more elaborate. But again, basically the structure, the core part of the structure is intelligible and clear to a cross community. And this is all because the Geonim standardized this before the great split occurred and sort of more fragmentation began taking place. So this is the achievements of the Geonim till the year, roughly till the year 1000.
What's their view on the Sura in the Sefer Torah? I mean, they wanted you must have a Sefer Torah, which is the same for everyone.
So interestingly, the standardized text of the Sefer Torah is a product not of the Geonim in Bavel, but the product of the Bali Masora, the Masoretes in Tiberia. who maybe weren't even completely Orthodox Jews. There may have been a group of Jews who are obsessed about text accuracy, who are the Karaites. Possibly. But let's avoid that controversy. But they are certainly Jews living in Severia, the famous Ben Osher family, the Ben Naphtali family, and these are generations who labor over ensuring accurate transmission of the text of the Torah. And even the great Rambam adopts the view of the Ben Osher family and their Sefer Torah, their famous codex, to as the standardized text of the Sefer Torah. So the fact that across the Jewish world we have a near identical Sefer Torah, famously Daka Aleph Hey at the end, but there's a few other differences. There's a handful of differences. In prevalent practice, there's about 5 letters of difference across the community, and perhaps as many as 11 if you look at slightly rarer Sifrei Torah. The fact that out of this body of text of more than 300,000 letters, there's only 11 differences, none of which change the meaning, is unbelievable, is an incredible achievement for a dispersed, exiled nation. But a large part of credit to that achievement does not belong to the Geonim, but belongs to the Bali Masura in Tiberia, who were trusted. What we do think is they weren't great Talmudists. Again, whether they Karaites and rejected the authority of the Talmud or not is controversial. But they even if we assume that they were rabbinic in the sense that they accepted rabbinic authority, we have no evidence or reason to believe they're great Talmudists. But they're great scholars of Dikduk and of Masora and so on, and it's their achievement that ensures that there's a standardized text of the Sefer Torah. The final achievement of the Gaon I want to talk about today is that of the Siddur. And this is associated, in answer to Neil's question, with one particular figure. Rav Amrom Gaon, we're talking about, we don't know exactly when he was born, but somewhere around the year 800 and dies around the year 875, or exactly the year 875. It's often easier to know the death of great people than their birth, because when they're born, no one knows they're going to be great, but when they die, they're famous by that point in their lives. So this is Rav Amrom Gaon. It's a 9th century figure, Rosh Yeshiva of Sura. We've mentioned the great yeshiva in Sura, and he authors many responsa. Many She'elos or Tshuvos. I think I've mentioned already, if I haven't, I should mention, that the Geonim are writing back and forth across the Jewish world. And we know more about this than was known in the past through the Cairo Geniza. This was always known about to some degree, but we found many more of the letters due to the Cairo Geniza. And he, like his other brother Geonim, is writing many She'elos or Tshuvos, but he also authors the famous Siddur Rav Amram Gaon. And really, the Siddur Rav Amram Gaon is a letter to the Jews of Al-Andalus. So the Jews of Al-Andalus write to Rav Amram Gaon, and they say, we're having a terrible time working out how to daven. We know from the Gemara, I don't even know if they know that, but if we had access to the Gemara, you can see some sort of structure to tefillah. The Gemara makes reference to an 18 bracha Amida, 19 bracha, because we add V'la Manshinim, Shmuel HaKotan in the era of the Gemara. There's already a Mishnaic era, but there's lots of other things you have to do. You have to say Shema. The Gemara makes references to Shema, and there's Birchas Shema. When do we say Shema? How do we structure that in line with Tefillah? How do we start? The Gemara references Birchas HaShachar, right? These are all Gemaras, but how do you actually build a siddur out of that and sort of have a structured siddur that will take you through this complex array of mitzvahs that you have to do every morning, which aren't just tefillah. Tefillah is very important of it, but it's also the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. And then the Gemara says you have to be masmich ge'ula l'tefillah. You have to make sure that you finish Go'al Yisrael and go straight into tefillah. Well, how do you structure that? So there's a whole array of complex halachas about how tefillah should be structured. How do you move into tefillah? Well, you should begin with some form of Hallel or praise to Hashem, what we call Pesukei Zimra, but what exactly is included in all of that? And basically, he writes a long letter to the Jews of Al-Andalus, the Jews of a region in Spain, and he structures for them the Siddur of Rav Amram, and this has become famous. This is his main claim to fame. Obviously, all his tshuvos are important, but the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon is very famous, and that really gave to this day the structure of tefillah in to our day. He also doesn't just suffice with giving a text of tefillah, again in answer, Neil, to your question, but it's got a sort of, I don't know, you can call it a running commentary on it. He'll add in many of the Gemara rules and halachos. It's got a bit like Art School has sets of halachos running alongside the tefillah, and various Gaonic era rules that were added to tefillah. And it served as a model for later Siddurim that were issued by Rav Saadia Gaon, by Rambam at the back of Mishnah Torah. The Rambam has a type of Siddur that he writes, and it's got 2 parts. It's got regular tefillah, and then it's got also slichas and pismonim for Elul and for Aseret Yemei Teshuvah and the like. As far as we know, this second part isn't with Amram Gaon himself, but is a later addition. But nonetheless, that's all. If you sort of download Siddur of Amram Gaon, you'll see these two sections to it, even though we don't really rely on the second part as coming from Rav Amram. And you can still see in the Sichos that we say today, if you use the Rosenberg edition or whatever, it has, or Art Scroll edition, it has some of them are Piyutim are ascribed to Rav Amram Gaon. Yes.
Is one understand that humility suffered from lack of clarity in the text due to the isolation or the attribution being lost, or is it that it was none, and therefore that's what was.
So as far as we can tell, there was no 2 points. Al-Angelas probably never had a text of its own tefillah. It probably wasn't learned enough to have created independently a type of siddur which somehow got lost due to persecution or the like. And even in the Gaonic era, there doesn't seem to have been a standardized text that everyone is using. As I said, when you emerge from the Gemara era, you have this massive, complicated body of text, which is the Gemara, and how are Amaraim meant to cope with it? So local authorities presumably gave them guidelines on Alchan Maisa, but no one created a sort of mass-produced standardized text that became a sort of fixed siddur of sorts. Until Rav Amram Gaon went through all the sugyas and all the halachos and all the gemaras and all the Gaonic era legislation and said, here's a pro forma, but if you do, we'll get you through all the halachos. Presumably, there was more flexibility initially because certain texts are fixed from the Anshe Knesset Gedolos, like the text of the Amidah, but other texts, and even then there's discussion about exactly how fixed it is, but it's certainly approximately fixed. But other aspects of tefillah, you've got flexibility, and that becomes standardized only later, only in the era of the Geonim, and that's the job that they took upon themselves. I'll mention that unfortunately we have no manuscript of the original letter of Rav Amram Gaon, and the manuscripts that we do have differ widely. Later authorities added in bits to them, took away bits as per local practice and their own view and so on. In others, it wasn't seen as this is sacrosanct. We have to preserve the exact text of Rav Amram in order to be authentic. Later Rishonim allowed themselves to tweak the text in line with their view. I'll give you another example of a Gaonic era text, the Kol Nidre text. So the Geonim standardized the opening of Yom Kippur with the Kol Nidre text, but as later figure as Rabbenu Tam in remote France says, well, I think the Geonim have got this wrong, and I'm going to tweak the text. And again, you can see to this day in the Kol Nidre in brackets, is Kol Nidre about declaring previous Nedarim annulled, or is it declaring future Nedarim annulled? And many times turns around and says, how can we annul previous Nedarim? You can't just cancel commitments you've made. There's a whole procedure if you think you made a mistake, and if you think that there's an error in your judgment of HaTorah and Nedarim, where you have to appear in front of 3 judges, and you have to justify your claim that this neder that was made was wrong. You can't just declare in shul that you're annulling your previous debt. The Geonim wrote it. Okay, the Geonim wrote it, but I, Rabbenu Tam, think this doesn't make halachic sense. And therefore, I'm going to tweak the text of Kol Nidre in order to refer to a declaration about future annulling rather than previous annulment. So the Rishonim saw themselves to a degree as being capable of here and there arguing with the Geonim. There's a lot of debate about to what degree the Geonim are in some sense their authority is accepted, a bit like the Gemara authority is accepted. And the answer is not completely. The Geonim are held in great awe, but they're not completely accepted by the Rishonim. They don't have the authority. A Rishon can't argue on a Gemara, but a Rishon can argue on the Geonim, and did so sometimes. And this is an example of it. So as a result, we don't have an accurate text of the letter of Rav Amram Gaon. More than that, we have references in the Rishonim to the Raavad, for example, will sometimes, or the Sefer Manig rather, will sometimes write. This is the popular version of the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon, but my version says something slightly different. I think the accurate manuscript says something different. All I will say is that this has established the text of Tefillas across Klal Yisrael, and all the differences that we see between the different nuschos are relatively mild. What is also true is that Nusach Ashkenaz is more similar to the text of the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon than Nusach Sfard, than the Nusach of the Eidat HaMizrach, which is interesting. Now, it's well, let me just explain what is interesting, what isn't interesting about this. What isn't surprising is that in the Middle East, Rav Amram Gaon's text had a lesser influence because the Middle East is the home of the Geonim, and Rav Amram Gaon was writing a letter to those who are removed from the Geonic centers. So it's possible that, in a sense, if you're local to the Geonim, there's different Geonim or different minhagim that developed. If you're far away and you're in a relatively unlearned community in Al-Andalas, the Gaonic authority is supreme because that's the only example of a city you've got, and therefore that molds the text of Tefillah more accurately. So that explains perhaps why the Middle Eastern text is a little bit less like it than the European text. But it's interesting that the Spanish rite is less like Rav Amram Gaon than the Ashkenazi rite, even though the letter is originally written to Spain. Nonetheless, it very quickly spreads to Ashkenaz, and they adopt it more closely than in Spain it's adopted. It seems that in Spain there are greater influences at work. And perhaps this gets back to your question that there was some form of siddur floating around, a proto-siddur, and therefore they didn't accept Rav Amram Gaon's siddur hook line, and they didn't completely accept it. Either way, all the nuschos are pretty similar to Rav Amram Gaon's siddur. By the way, there's a lot of mythology. This is polemics now, so forgive me for this, but for just 2 minutes, there's a lot of mythology out there in the sort of pop academic world of Al-Andalas being more closely linked to the Gaonic tradition than the Ashkenazi world, and a sort of created Al-Andalas Gaonic tradition and so on. And most of it is nonsense. It's peddled with various agendas at work. It's very, very complicated how the sphere of how the influence of the Geonim spread, and who was more loyal to the Geonim, and who more had the Geonic tradition and less had the Geonic tradition. There's a sort of geographical instinct that, well, Spain is on the Mediterranean basin, and therefore surely the lines of transmission had to be clearer. And it's far, far more complicated. There are no simplistic answers to these questions. Many, many years ago, when I began reading, we were told a lot that Minhag Ashkenaz was very heavily influenced by what they used to call the Palestinian rite. That means not Palestinians, but it means the rite of the Talmud Yerushalmi. And the chain of transmission was from Eretz Yisrael through Italy, up the Rhine to Germany. And therefore, Minhagei Ashkenaz were more influenced by the Talmud Yerushalmi, and Spain more by the Talmud Bavli, and so on. Since then, it's been proven that this isn't accurate, particularly. It is true that in poetical liturgy, Piyutim, Ashkenaz was very influenced by the great Italian Paitanim, famously the Clonimus family that migrated from Italy into Germany and were very creative Paitanim and brought with them a lot of poetry and so on. But in minhag and in population and so on, it's far more complicated than that. And in certain respects, Ashkenaz is closer to the Bavel, closer to the Geonim than Saadia, and in other respects not. It's just very, very complicated, and you can't neatly summarize in sort of one breath. So anyone who's making sort of sweeping statements about the Geonic Al-Andalas tradition, there's a lot of no true Scotsman stuff at work. There also, which any Al-Andalas minhag or Spanish minhag that doesn't fit this, well, it's not the real thing. Okay, polemic over. I'm just venting frustrations. That's been therapeutic. Thank you for listening. Yes. Yes. Okay, so the Ethiopians are completely out of this conversation. Not only are they out of the Gaonic conversation, they're even out of the Talmudic conversation, possibly even out of the Mishnaic conversation. So they are charting their own course through history. The Ammonites are not lost from Jewish history at all. They are constantly part of the sort of international Jewish conversation. And the Rambam writes them, and many others right there. They're absolutely part of the Jewish conversation. They're no way lost or out of things. The main difference is they are the single largest community of Jews who didn't accept the authority of the Shulchan Aruch in the way that the rest of the world Jewry did. And that's where things differ with the Ammonites, because they accepted in a significant degree the authority of the Rambam, and that's where it stops. The Rambam became their Shulchan Aruch in many respects, not completely. So that's like a very significant part of the Gaonic, of the Ammonite differences. But the Rambam, don't forget, is 200 years after the close of the Gaonic era. So they are absolutely part of the conversation till that point. And even after that, they're part of the conversation. It's not that they're unaware of scholarship taking place in Sfat, where Rabbi Yosef Kar is. They just don't accept in the same way to the same degree of authority. Perhaps certain communities of them, a lot of controversy around this, and I don't want to go into this, whether they accept the authority of the Zohar and to the same degree, or because of the influence of the Rambam. They're the last pocket of resistance to the Kabbalistic takeover of the philosophers. So these all, again, beyond the scope of our discussion. As far as no, they are part of the discussion. And again, in a significant level, their siddur, which is very different to everyone else's siddur, doesn't differ enormously from the Gaonic era siddur. Okay, let's spend a little bit of time talking about how are we doing time-wise? Let's spend a little bit of time talking about other Geonim, and I'll mention briefly. I'm going to just try and go in a chronological order some of the Geonim that I want to focus on till we get to the great Rav Saadia Gaon, at which point obviously we will pause. So just getting back to the start of the Gaonic era. So the Talmudic era closes, and we have about 100 years in which the main Gaonic project is editing the Gemara and perhaps tidying up texts and the like, and we refer to this as the era of the Savaraim. Then the Savaraim, this remains controversial to this day exactly how much they edit the text of the Gemara, but the fact is that the text of the Gemara is not really complete until about 100 years after the close of the Gemara, and this isn't a controversial statement. The Rishonim were aware of this, and various sections of the Gemara, the Rishonim will say this isn't Talmud from the Amaraim, this is Savaraic era. This is the sort of interregnum period. You can call it early Gaonic or late Amaraic. But after the Gemara is completed, it's a massive project. It needs an enormous amount of editing and structuring, and this is the Savaraim who do this. And to some degree or other, even later Geonim continue to tweak it here or there to tidy up the text. And it's not always clear which texts are Geonic, which are Savaraic, and which are Amaraic. But that's what goes on. How do we know about this, by the way? Well, we'll get right to the close of the Gaonic era, when a Gaon called Rav Sherira Gaon is asked again by the Jews outside Bavel, this time by the Jews of Kariates in North Africa. He's asked, tell us about the history of the Geonim, tell us about how the Gemara is formed. And he writes a very long letter, known as the Igeres, the epistle, the letter of Rav Sherira Gaon, in which he summarizes Jewish history from the Gemara period through to the end of the Gaonic period. Well, he didn't know it's going to be the end, but till the closing years of the Gaonic period. And it's from him that we know a lot of the chains of succession. I mentioned that we have quite good knowledge of the chains of succession of the Geonim, the sort of lineage of the Rosh Yeshivas, and the exilarchs, the Rosh Galusa. So he lists traditions. The Geonim are very proud of their traditions, and he lists traditions of chains of succession of the Geonim and the Rishonim and the Rosh Galusa through the generations. And he tells us a lot about the transmission of Torah during the Gaonic era. And one of the things he tells us about is the Savaraim, this era of the closure of the Gemara, this 100 plus years in which the post-Talmudic figures are still editing and tidying up the text of the Gemara. Okay, we now enter fully into the Gaonic era. And the first Gaon, in inverted commas, and I'll tell you in a minute why I call him inverted Gaons, who we know authored a book where we know the name of the author, a Jewish book, a halachic book where we know the name of the author, is Rav Achai Gaon, again died at 752, presumably born somewhere in the late 600s. So we're talking about late 600s, 50 years after the end of the Savaraim, maybe 100 years after the end of the Savaraim. Rav Achai Gaon, born late 600s perhaps, dies at 752, and he writes a work of, he's Rav Achai of Shavcha. Anyone who remembers or Shivcha, anyone who remembers it's a Talmudic era town that we know about, it's mentioned in the Gemara here or there, and he writes a book called the She'iltos. Now, he's an important figure because he's the first known named Jewish author post the Talmudic era. So the first book, halachic work, Torah work, that we know the name of the author and has been widely accepted as a Torah work. Presumably there were odd bits and pieces that people were writing in between. First one that became a work of literature, of Jewish literature, post the Chasimas, the Talmud, Rav Achai Gaon, died in 750, 752, 753, and therefore presumably born in the late 600s. And he wrote his work, halachic work, which I'll talk about more in a moment, called the She'iltos. Now, interestingly, and I think, and possibly Neil, someone asked last week, well, there's only ever one or two Geonim per generation. So how much other Talmudic learning is there going? And I mentioned that there's whole yeshivas and academies and students of students, and there were lesser yeshivas, but the technical title of Gaon was reserved for the Rosh Yeshivas. Rav Achai Gaon was not a Gaon, meaning he never became the Rosh Yeshiva. However, he lived in the Gaonic era, and he was acknowledged when the Gaon of Pumbedita died. He was acknowledged as the most prominent, preeminent Talmud Chacham and sage of his era. However, something we mentioned before, an exilarch, Reish Galusa, Shlomo bar Chistoi, doesn't like him. He thinks he's too powerful, too clever, and he doesn't want him to become the Gaon of Pumbedita. And an inferior to Achai is appointed as the new Gaon, and Achai is he's excluded from a position, which is serious, obviously, because it means he also doesn't have a panasa and the like. But that's the way it worked. This was a time in which the Rosh Galusa had dominance over the Geonim, and they managed to interfere in the succession. In the end, perhaps because of this, Rav Achai is able to author this work, because he doesn't have, as I mentioned already, the Geonim don't author that many works. Most of the works that we have of the Geonim are later works of letters that they write to far-flung communities who are interested in things. Within Bavel, they see their main aim as orally transmitting Torah. In fact, we said even the texts of the Talmud Bavli may not have been written down, but been preserved through oral memory. So the Geonim aren't writing Sepharim, but Rav Achai, and maybe they don't have the time to do so because their responsibility is to teach and lecture, maybe they don't have the interest to do so, they don't believe that's the main way Torah should be transmitted. Torah should be transmitted through Baal Peh still, even though a text is fixed now in the Gemara. But Rav Achai, who's now sadly excluded from Gaonic academies and he's unable to teach, he writes the She'iltos. He moves to Eretz Yisrael, by the way, because he hasn't got any ties to Bavel, sadly. He hasn't got a job there, and he dies in Eretz Yisrael, and that's Rav Achai Gaon. Yes.
What evidence we have to actually say that into the text?
No, so this is very controversial. The fixing of the text of the Gemara is more or less concluded by the end of the Savaraim era. But at what point does it go into writing? We don't know. Possibly, the extreme view is as late as very near the end of the Gaonic era, in other words, in the 900s. The more mainstream view is sometime soon after the text is fixed, in the 700s or something like that. But it's orally transmitted till then, and reliably orally transmitted. We know that people are capable of great feats of memory, and the Gaonic era had systems of chazara and many people learning and memorizing. But it was only once it was written down that again Torah could flourish in the far-flung corners of the Jewish world. So you can't have serious Torah learning going on in the 950s in Germany if they didn't have a text of Gemara. We know by that point there's the Chachmei Magnesia, the yeshiva in Mainz, which has become a sort of flourishing, almost Gaonic academy. So sometime late 800s, it's in early 900s. It's definitely written down, but probably before then.
Nothing going prior to these.
Not as far as I know. Not hard evidence. I may be wrong. Not as far as I know. So what is the She'iltos? Very briefly, it's a halachic work. It opens each She'iltot from the word She'ela. It opens each section with the word She'ela, question. It's possible that his move to Eretz Yisrael maybe gave him more exposure to the Talmud Yerushalmi, because he does quote the Talmud Yerushalmi a little bit more than is typical of the Geonim. He also quotes midrashim that we think are authored in Eretz Yisrael, like the Medrash Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah, the Medrash Tanchuma, and so on, all of whom are quoted in, all of which are perhaps Eretz Yisrael, probably Eretz Yisrael compositions. A lot of controversy around all of this, and we don't need to go into that detail. And he'll often link it to the Sedra. He'll link it to a mitzvah. For example, I don't know, Parshas Noach, he'll talk about Chomos, and then he'll talk about theft and violence and so on. And what's interesting also is, uniquely amongst the Geonim, perhaps again because he lost his position, is it doesn't seem to have been only developed for Talmidei Chachomim, for sages, but also he wanted it to be a popular work, and that's probably the reason it survives. So he'll do a bit of drush and link it to the Sedra and so on, which is indication that this isn't an elite scholarly work just designed for the scholars. Again, there's perhaps two reasons why he may have done this. Either because he's arrived in Eretz Israel where there is a decline in Talmudic scholarship. People still know Midrashim because people like Midrashim, people like the stories, but there's a decline in classic Talmudic scholarship. Perhaps that's why it becomes popular. So again, I suppose out of the tragedy of his life, which is he didn't become a Gaon, out of that emerged cultural cross-fertilization, because he's a Gaon status person who moves to Eretz Israel and meets Israeli Torah, meets Eretz Israel Torah, Midrashim, and so on. And because of that, perhaps he becomes more of a popular writer. He writes a little bit in the style of Drush. Maybe that's what he needs to do in order to appeal to the population in Eretz Israel. And his work becomes immensely popular. Parts of the Shiltas have been found in the Kariates, by the way, I should mention. The Shiltas have been found in the Kariates. In brief, it becomes very, very popular in a very short amount of time. And we know that because the other later Geonim are already quoting this work and are very excited by it. What else can we say? He brings minhagim. That's also useful. He brings minhagim in it. He brings the minhag of the Metorgaman. Are you aware of the Metorgaman minhag? So we have we have the Torah and then we have the Targum, but he brings the minhag that the Balkura used to read the pasuk and then a Metorgaman, a person with a loud voice, a translator, would respond to each pasuk and say it aloud. But not necessarily louder than the Balkura could. By the way, in the Gemara already you find a different type of Metorgaman, which is when you have an elderly Rosh Hashiva or sage teaching Torah in a vast Gaonic or Amaraim academy, yeshiva. How could people hear it? And the Metorgaman would shout it out. The Gemara brings amazing stories of modesty, where the Metorgaman wouldn't repeat entirely accurately what the Rosh Hashiva had said, or try and introduce his own chedushim, and the dilemma that the Rosh Hashiva faced. If it's wrong, he needs to intervene, but if it's right, albeit not what he had wanted to say, then maybe save the person embarrassment and let them do this. Very interesting stories about this, and Achai brings some of these. And I think for our purposes, that's what we need to say about Rav Achai. Some 50 years later, we have the next Gaonic work written, which is the BeHa, or the Halachos Gedolos, which I should mention, or the Halachos Gedolos is the BeHa. We think the author of the Halachos Gedolos is someone called Reb Shimon Kaira. Again, so we're talking about a halachist of the first half of the 8th century. Again, we're not entirely sure who the author is, but it appears probable, if it's Shimon Kaira, who we think it was, again, he's not a Gaon. So the same phenomena at work, a world-class sage, Talmud Chacham, perhaps one of the preeminent sages of his generation, but nonetheless doesn't become a Gaon, and therefore perhaps has time or interest in writing. Geonim don't write that much, either because they don't have the time to write, or because of their teaching responsibilities, or because they don't think that's the primary way to teach Torah. And either way, the Gaonic tradition recorded by later Geonim is that Reb Shimon Kaira is the author of the Halachos Gedolos, and again a non Gaon. What is the Halachos Gedolos? Again, a halachic work, as per its name. It lists halachas, and it became very, very important in the transmission of Torah. One time we mentioned this halachic work is he lists 613 commandments, and he includes mitzvahs drabanan in the 613 commandments. I think I referenced that when I spoke about the Geonim's battle against the Karaites, and we also definitely spoke about this when we looked, again online, when we looked at mitzvahs drabanan, the authority of the drabanan. So just to remind you, the simplest understanding of the Medrash that gathered to Gemara is that 613 mitzvahs were transmitted to Moshe at Sinai, in which case you by definition can't include the 7 rabbinic mitzvahs. Nonetheless, the BeHa takes a maximalist position and somehow thinks even these 7 mitzvahs were transmitted to Moshe on Har Sinai. How on earth can you claim that? Maybe Moshe has given the mitzvahs in potential and their trigger data, but it's a very, very maximalist claim for rabbinic authority, perhaps contextualized by the battle against the Karaites at the time, perhaps not, and this is his view. And either way, despite the steam in which the Halachos Gedolos is held, roundly fought by later figures. The Rambam opens his list of 613 mitzvahs with a long introduction, a 14-part introduction, in which he establishes rules for the inclusion or exclusion of mitzvahs, and he is very clear that the seven rabbinic mitzvahs shouldn't be included in the list of 613 mitzvahs. I think for now we will stop listing the Geonim, and we'll spend today looking at Rav Saadia Gaon's life. And so we're jumping forward in time now from early Geonim, who are the first known named Geonim that we know of. Sorry, not first named Geonim. We have the list from the Igeres of Sura, but the first Geonim who are authors, these very early works, the Sheiltos and the Halachos Gedolos. And now we're going to move forward to the year 882 of the Common Era. So we're going forward 40 years from the time of the Halachos Gedolos, and we hit the figure of Rav Saadia Gaon, and this is the figure that we're going to spend a decent amount of time talking about, because he is a towering figure, beyond famous and powerful in his life, and the first Jewish philosopher. I can't say he's the first Jewish philosopher. We don't know who the first Jewish philosopher was. Jews were presumably worrying about philosophical ideas, but certainly the first systematic, published Jewish philosopher that we know of. Now, let's just talk a little bit about his life. So I mentioned already, he is born in Egypt, and he achieves the status of being the first foreign-born Gaon, non-Babylonian-born Gaon. He's also known as Al-Fayoumi, the Fayoumite, because he comes from a region of Egypt called Fayoum, or a town in Egypt called Fayoum. He spends the first few years of his life, perhaps till 20, learning Torah in Egypt, and also learning philosophy, astronomy, Arabic literature. He's an Arabic-speaking Gaon. This is the time in which things are shifting from Aramaic to Arabic. The Geonim are based in Bavel, in Iraq, where Aramaic has been the spoken tongue for 1,000 years. It's a very sophisticated culture. It's okay, we've been conquered by these Arab upstarts, but it doesn't mean we're going to give up our culture to them. So there's resistance, but eventually Arabic overtakes Aramaic. The only relatively early culture only culture taken over relatively early by Islam, by Arabic forces, and yet succeeds in avoiding Arabization is, of course, Persia. So Iran, the neighbor of Iraq, doesn't become Arabized, but remains Persian, speaking Persian, though they adopt Arabic script. But Iraq doesn't. Iraq becomes Arabized, and therefore these great Babylonians effectively become Arabs of sorts and speak Arabic and the like. So this is the era in which Arabic is taking over, and Rav Saadia Gaon is born in Egypt. He's certainly Arabic speaking. Egypt doesn't have by that point a strong enough culture to resist Arabization. He fights the Karaites. We already discussed that. He achieves the status of becoming a Gaon. We already discussed that. He is one of the authorities in before even he becomes a Gaon in reestablishing and stabilizing the calendar. We discussed that also, his fight against the Rosh Hashiva in Eretz Yisrael, who, according to the Babylonian Geonim, makes a mistake in the declaration of the new moon and the fixing of the next year's calendar, and his authority already pre-Gaon, he's not yet been appointed as a Gaon, he's still a relatively young genius from Egypt, and nonetheless he swings the battle in favor of the Geonim, perhaps particularly because it's in Egypt, which is geographically near Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the loyalty of Egypt can't be taken for granted, but he swings the battle in favor of the Geonim, and he succeeds in stabilizing the calendar, and eventually appointed a Gaon. He's held in awe by later Jewish philosophers like the Rambam, but they also disagree with him, and that will be what we look at next week when we actually understand the sort of conversations that take place between Rav Saadia Gaon and the other Geonim. He translates the Torah into Arabic. He's the first to do that. What's the translation of the Torah being used till that point? The Targum. What's the Targum translated into? Aramaic, right? The Targum ceases to be useful for many, perhaps most Jews, and therefore he creates a new Targum, which is the Targum into Aramaic, and this is known as, sorry? Everything is somewhat contentious, but Rav Saadia Gaon reigns so supreme. He's so clearly head and shoulders above everyone else that he triumphs in all these things. There is politics around him. Maybe I can mention this. When he is appointed as Gaon, the Rosh Galusa is very excited about it and behind him, and because it's a coup, they're bringing this world-class scholar to Bavel, and friends of the Rosh Galusa warn him. They say he's too powerful, and within 6 years, the Rosh Galusa regrets his appointment. And because Rav Gaon doesn't, there's no holds barred. He is such a dominant personality in terms of his charisma, in terms of his powerful personality, and just in terms of his scholarship. He can do anything. So there is controversy around many of the things he does, but he's not afraid of controversy, and he triumphs in them. Yeah.
He reminds me.
Who does he remind you of, Simon? Okay, that's a really interesting comment. He does remind me of him, and in my mind, I often think of that also emerging, well, somewhat from Egypt, but yeah, okay. It's funny because in my mind, I often think of that comparison, but in no scholarly sense is that really true. But yes, he does remind me of that. Yes, I must confess. Yes.
The criteria at the time of the reading from Aramaic into Arabic without Arabic, and that's paid.
Yes, okay, so that's a fair point. His Arabic translation becomes very successful. It doesn't ever achieve the sort of same status as the Targum Unclus. The Targum Unclus at the end of the day dates back to the era of Unclus. Haggai is a Tanaitic era figure. The Gemara says about the Targum Unclus that it's Halach Moshe Sinai. It's all given to Moshe on Sinai. Now, whether it means that literally or it means it's so accurate that it's as if it's a Sinai translation. So you're not going to replace the authority of the Targum Unclus. Nonetheless, the Targum Unclus becomes very difficult for people, and it becomes scholars can still look at it, but the populace are using the Tafsir, the so-called Tafsir, the translation of Rav Tzaddik. Yes. But there are communities, by the way, that do that. I believe there's parts of the Yemenite community that still use the Tafsir as a working translation, and perhaps even adopted it as a Targum type format where someone would read Leining and then someone else would read the Tafsir's translation. I think there are parts of the Yemenite community that I should check up into that afterwards. I'm speaking from memory here, but I believe there's parts of the Yemenite community that use his translation. And he continues obviously to be cited by later authorities, Ibn Ezra and the like. He's not just a pioneer in philosophy, he's also a pioneer in Jewish grammar. He wrote a dictionary and a grammar work called Sefer HaEgron, and we'll discuss next week his philosophical work, his Emunah V'Deus. Is there a commonality between someone who writes philosophy and someone who writes grammar? Is there a link between the two? How can you have a language where no one's written a systematic grammar book before Rav Saadia Gaon? Can such a language flourish? Who speaks good English here? How many of you read an English grammar book? Right, you don't need or write grammar books necessarily until you are somewhat of an outsider and you want to systemize something that's a bit foreign to you. When you are a native speaker, you don't necessarily think about grammar. As I've mentioned before, many people, when they learn French for the first time and say, oh, it's so amazing, French, they have all these different sorts of past tense, pluperfect, right? None of us have ever heard of the word pluperfect when we do French. Even now to this day, I'm not entirely sure what it means. But in English, there's all these forms also. We just don't think about it. You sort of pick it up organically. There's a commonality between systemizing grammar studies and systemizing philosophy. In both cases, you are somewhat of an outsider trying to bring tools to bear on a system. The reason Jews don't do philosophy till this point is because they they do it organically. That you have medrash, you have stories, you have narrative. As I mentioned before, there's Shakespeare has great psychological insights. But he's not a psychologist in the same way as a scientific psychologist. So Freud is. Again, whether you like or dislike Freud, whether you like or dislike Shakespeare, they both offer routes to enormous insight into how humans work. But Freud is doing it as a scientist. He's trying, in a sense, to measure things in the lab, whereas an artist is doing it through storytelling. So Chazal, everyone has a philosophy, and this is one of the things I'm trying to bring out in the series on philosophy. In a way, we haven't just been talking about the Geonim's history, we've been talking about the Geonim's philosophy, a philosophy of teaching, oral transmission, fighting the Karaites. Everyone has a philosophy, but systemizing philosophy is when you're stepping outside and looking at it from an outsider, is only when you're forced to do so and challenged to do so, in the case of Jews, largely by the Greek tradition as transmitted via the Arabs. So Jews meet Plato and Aristotle as transmitted through the Arab tradition. We mentioned that Arabs and Jews alike have the sort of imaginary composite figure of Plato and Aristotle. We did that in an earlier series on Jewish philosophy. Rav Saadia Gaon confronts them and he has to systemize it. Learning grammar as a system is also systemization of something that should be organic. So we're going through a stage when Jews shift from being organic to being systematic. And with that shift, I'll come to you in a moment, you gain something and you lose something. You gain something because it's systemized, but you lose something because it's not natural. You're not just living in it by stepping out, being challenged, in a sense, you're forced to become more reflective. You do metacognition. You think about what you're thinking, but you also lose something because it's no longer just how you are and unchallenged, critiqued. It's just sort of natural in a way. The analogy I use for this is there's two ways of learning French. You can learn French in the classroom in school, or you can go and live with a French peasant family for a year, and you'll pick up the language differently in different ways, and different minds, by the way, will benefit from the two models to different degrees. But each one has a certain advantage. In the classroom, you will never learn. The French peasant may occasionally use ungrammatical French. The question is, what does ungrammatical French even mean? Meaning, if everyone uses a double negative, in English as per many slangs, is that really ungrammatical, or is this simply another way of speaking language? Is grammar an attempt to impose a sort of top-heavy system on something which actually isn't organically like that? So you lose something by systemization. It becomes somewhat less organic and somewhat less natural. Nonetheless, you have no choice but to do it when you are challenged in that way. So this is the change happening. And whether I'll mention, to this day, there is some hesitancy around, for example, the field of grammar, like there is around the field of philosophy in the Jewish world. Grammar, a degree of grammar knowledge is necessary, but in the traditional curriculum, the yeshiva curriculum, in many times in history, grammar wasn't taught systematically. In the world of yeshivas, it wasn't taught. You were sort of expected to pick it up naturally. Even to this day, in learning Gemara, very few people introduce Gemara in a systematic way. Perhaps people who didn't go through the yeshiva system, Bali Tshuva, who didn't have a chance to learn Gemara when they're younger. So you'll go to a structured Gemara program where someone will explain Brisa and Mishnah and the language of the Gemara and the Stamaim and how it works and the vocabulary. Someone who's gone through the sort of classical Cheder system, you just pick up Gemara organically. You just immerse yourself in it, and that's how you kind of learn it. I'll come to a moment. That's how you kind of learn it without it being systemized. The problem is, once the genie is out of the bottle, once the challenges emerge, you can't help but do that. And any attempt to restore to a sort of pre-philosophy world is doomed, because you can't but help use the language of the philosophers even to defend your anti-philosophical stance. So if you are opposed to the trends of philosophy being introduced to Judaism, you have to express your opposition. As soon as you're expressing your opposition, you're entering into the world of debate. You're already outside the natural, organic immersion in the BeHa Medrash, and therefore, again, you're talking the language of philosophy to a degree. So once this genie is out of the bottle, it can't be put back. But Rav Saadia Gaon is the great figure who takes that out of the BeHa Medrash. Let me just mention a few more points, and then I'll come to questions. I should mention he writes a lot. He writes philosophically. He writes a siddur, by the way, another siddur with tweaks on the earlier siddur. He writes Shabbos Teshuvah, halachic response. That's obviously a main part of the Gaonic job, and the like. He's a poet, I should mention. He's a very gifted poet. He writes a number of piyutim, some of which we still have to this day. His most famous piyut, quoted widely by the Rishonim, is the Azhoros of Rav Saadia Gaon. It used to be recited on Shavuos. It's a list of the 613 commandments in poetry, and enormously studied. The Tosfos quote it for its halachic viewpoint. An enormous work was written on it by someone called Rabbi Yerucham Fischel Perlow of Warsaw. I'm talking about 100 years ago. 3-volume work on it, an amazing work. So it's very, very important work. And he's writing in Arabic, or more technically, Judeo-Arabic. What's Judeo-Arabic? A bit like Yiddish is relationship to German, a sort of Jewish dialect of Arabic, and writing in Hebrew letters Arabic. So the Jews are doing this now. They're writing in Hebrew letters Arabic language with some of their own jargon, some of their own Jewish terminology. And as I said, he led the Sura yeshiva for many years, and he's followed by successors. His son takes over as Gaon of Dosla, and so on for many, many years. Sorry, you've been waiting patiently. Do you want to tell something?
What was I?
Yes.
Let's call
One of the results of the scientific mind taking over is it formalizes things, and it doesn't have the same tolerance for error. That's true. So even, and this is a little disturbing or uncomfortable. We nowadays, when we meet a shear, a measure, a halachic measure, so an amor, for example, so we want to know how long is an amor. Is it 45 centimeters, 48 centimeters, 60 centimeters? And there's a whole load of halachos about it. A tefach, an etzba, and these are all matters of halachic discussion. In the past, in the pre-scientific era, presumably an amor, someone took their arm and measured it. So part of the journey from medrash or agoda or narrative or organic to scientific or philosophical or grammatical or systemized is you move from the subjective to the objective to a degree because you're looking for absolute measures
But that's
and scientific precision around that. Yeah.
precision. And today, for example, we look at pronunciation of grammar. The result of people not studying grammar for reasons of
Yes.
that it's by errors. People really.
So again, this is a point absolutely right. Engaging in philosophy tidies up philosophical thinking, and sometimes if you don't do it, you think you have wonderful intuitions, but it's actually messy thinking at work. So you've lost something by having to systemize, but you've gained something. And engagement in grammar increases people's accuracy in pronunciation, in stress and mil'el mirah and shavana and shavanoch and so on. And once you've lost the organic transmission, you have no choice but to learn grammar. But if you've grown up in the world or in a Hebrew-speaking world or a world which, even if it's Aramaic or Arabic-speaking, has such a degree of engagement with Hebrew that it's still organic, then you don't need the same grammatical works because it's organic. We maybe need it because we're living in a non-halacha-speaking world. By the way, Hebrew grammar itself is somewhat of a controversial subject because it does a little bit. The grammarians do a little bit of what I mentioned grammarians do, let's say in the UK, where we'll say it's ungrammatical to use a double negative. What do you mean it's ungrammatical? If the job of grammarians is to define how people speak, why should we give dominance or more credence to a part of the population which perhaps by and large are more widely educated and happen to be the ones who write books who don't use double negatives, when there's a significant part of the UK population who do think it's okay to use double negatives? Surely the job of a grammarian is simply to define a language. And we sometimes even know that some of these so-called non-grammatical forms of English date back. Some of them are linked to even Saxon and Norman divides, where so-called lower classes preserve various traditions of how spoken English is like. And you have exactly the same thing in Hebrew grammar. Now, you may say, how can you have such a same thing in Hebrew grammar? Surely it's a God-given language, and therefore there's only one precise grammar. And the answer is, well, yes and no. Maybe it's a God-given language, but humans speak it, and things can evolve. And we see the change in grammar through the period, even in the period of Tanakh and onto Mishnaic era. And maybe it's not a God-given language in the sense that maybe it's a Semitic language, and that's again a subject of debate beyond our discussion. That maybe it's a Semitic language which God then sanctified and gave kedusha to. So you will hear modern grammarians even making claims that Nevi'im made grammatical mistakes. Now, there's Rishonim, even grammarian Rishonim like the Bavel, who make that claim. And I simply want to point out that Rishonim made it, so it's not theologically heretical to say. Maybe a Novi could make a grammatical mistake. Don't forget, the Nevi'im are not dictated texts from Hashem. They are their own language in which they're trying to record their visions. But maybe, we shouldn't be so arrogant as grammarians. And maybe there were different styles of speaking. Who are we to know that this is a grammatical mistake? I'll give you one very famous example of this, and with this I will conclude. In Agoda, we have a pasuk, Arami Oved Avi Vayered Mitzrayma. Referring to the events of this week's Zedra, but the quote comes from Sefer Devarim, where they record Jewish history. Now, how do we translate this? The Haggadah takes this, and this is how Rashi and the Torah takes it, as an Aramean, i.e. Lovan Arami, destroyed or attempted to destroy my father Yaakov. So it's translating the word Oved as causative. Now, in modern grammatical understanding, that's simply incorrect. If you want to say causative, you'd have to say Ibed Avi or Abed Avi, you'd have to have some causative word. Oved means the passive, lost, in which case the translation would be a lost Aramean was my father. A wandering Aramean people have possibly heard. However, that wasn't the tradition that Chazal had in the translation. So what did they? Is this a medrash? Did they get it wrong? Were they saying it somehow allegorically because it's not literally what it means? Because we know the rules of grammar. And the rules of grammar tell us that Oved is the passive form, not the active form, not the causative form. Well, maybe yes, maybe not. Maybe Chazal had the tradition or understood, or maybe those who organically spoke Hebrew understood that Ovaid can sometimes be used in the causative form. All grammar is sort of retrofitting, is retroactively looking at what humans do and trying to draw out rules. The first English speakers didn't have grammar rule books, they just spoke English. Grammarians come along and, in a sense, scientifically try to draw out principles or rules from it, and there's something, in a sense, non-Jewish about that. There's something, not by that I mean not in line with how Jews traditionally did things when they were still able to operate organically. Okay, we've run out of time, so I'll have to stop. Please forgive me, and I've just realized I have to go on to my next share, but I wish everyone a wonderful day.